Thank you, Mr. Chairman Doyle and Ranking Member Latta for holding a hearing and for our panelists. It's been a great discussion. I greatly appreciate this committee's continued focus on closing the digital divide, which still impacts far too many Americans in rural America, Indian country, and throughout urban America too. In rural Arizona, only 66% of population has access to broadband at the FCC's minimum speed standard. It's far worse than that in my district. I'm thankful that last Congress, this committee bipartisanly had efforts that resulted in an omnibus package that with programs to help the underserved, such as the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, to address broadband affordability, nearly $1.3 billion in dedicated funding, to expand broadband on the tribal lands at tribal colleges, universities, and minority institutions, and new federal offices to better coordinate multiple broadband programs and more. There's clearly more work to be done to expand broadband access nationwide. We must continue working together across the aisle to help them implement these new programs and improve existing programs as well. I guess my biggest issue is that if we don't do that working across the aisle, we're going to continue to see, as it was mentioned earlier, issues raised in 2006 and still not recognized as being accomplished by now. We're still going to get to the point that we are today, that rural America has basically been forgotten for a couple of decades to get us to where we are competitive for our towns, our cities, our economic development, our hospitals, and our children's education. Mr. Shelton, in your testimony, you discussed how the FCC's Universal Service Fund is relying on a declining contribution base, which supports many critical programs. Could you highlight the importance of funding a bipartisan and consensus-based path forward to provide stability to the CSF contribution methodology in a way that preserves the success of its programs, helping underserved Americans?
Now, the Universal Service Fund only takes into consideration voice, taxes on voice, and voice keeps going down. And we have to figure out ways to make sure that that Universal Service Fund is actually applied to broadband, because broadband is the future here, as everybody said, and that there's places in this country, rural places, not mostly, but a lot of rural places that companies are not willing to go in and put in broadband because it's too expensive. Well, we have to figure out a way to have those companies, by private and public partnerships, to get access in rural places, because people in rural places need broadband just like anybody in an urban environment needs broadband. And my members are willing to go to wherever they can to put it in. The other thing that I have to say here is there's been some talk about a shortage of telecommunications technicians to do this work. Well, I can tell you that the big companies have laid off tens of thousands of my members who are absolutely trained and ready to go anywhere they need to go tomorrow morning or this afternoon to put in broadband and maintain broadband. So, the Universal Service Fund is just one of the ways to do this, but without public and private partnerships, we're never going to get this done. And we got to get it done, because this country cannot go on like this.
Thank you, Mr. Shelton. Dr. Anderson, thank you for everything you do to help our students during this pandemic. My wife's a former educator. Could you briefly discuss the specific needs tribal students are facing in your community to distance learn due to lack of access to connected devices or fixed services?
And I'll speak to really a compliment to what Mr. Shelton shared. It's infrastructure. And so we have tribal students that they don't have the infrastructure in place, much like our rural students as well, but they don't have the infrastructure in place. So there really can be almost extreme isolation in terms of access and ability. The kinds of things that we might provide other students right in the city of Topeka is not as accessible because those students and those families, the manner where they live, even the libraries and the buildings that they have, doesn't have any infrastructure in those tribal organizations to be able to serve those students as well as we should. I do want to mention, although I know this wasn't part of the question, our rural America piece. When we gave out that map, what we learned really quickly is, much like our tribal students, they didn't have access to the store for Wi-Fi. They didn't have access to a McDonald's for Wi-Fi. They didn't have access to any other places that inner city Topeka had access to. So again, that infrastructure is the issue. And so even with the items that we began to provide, if there's no infrastructure in place, we're just putting a Band-Aid on items.
Thank you, Doctor. I'm way over my time and I yield that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.